lives. Even at the local movie house, where whites sat in the middle and everyone else sat on the sides. Then one day, things changed.
In 1946, there was a young guy by the name of Sisi. He was a Pachuco, he was a zoo tutor, who went out to the Navy, came back, put on his civvies, and went to the movies. And since he was serving his country, he felt that he had a right to sit wherever he wanted, so he came and sat in the middle. He wouldn't move, so the police arrested him. There was no law that said you couldn't sit in the middle, so they couldn't charge him with anything, not even disturbing the peace. He was pretty peaceful. So they grilled him for a couple hours and then released him. And everybody noticed. They said, hey, CC got away with it. He was sat in the middle. So the following week, everybody sat in the middle section. And the town movie house was desegregated. And that happened across the entire valley. Some 20 years later, when I told my mom I was going back to Toledo to work with the union, she says, oh, you're going to work with Sisi. And I said, Sisi? Is that Vato still around? And she says, mijo, don't you know who Sisi is? He's Cesar Chavez.
In the 1960s, Cesar Chavez would become the most significant Mexican-American leader of his generation. He would join forces with Dolores Huerta to champion the human rights of some of America's poorest workers.
The workers were literally like slaves. The living conditions were horrendous, and the children were barefoot. And I thought, well, this is so wrong.
Their success would ignite a movement challenging a long history of prejudice and injustice. In East Los Angeles, a high school teacher led the largest student walkout in history, risking his own freedom to give Mexican-American students a chance at a quality education.
It was a risk, it was a gamble, but the gamble that had to be taken. We're trying to make schools better, trying to make the country better.
In Crystal City, Texas, a graduate student founded a political party, transforming centuries of oppression into ethnic power.
Reckless, yes. Dangerous, extremely. Did it pay off? Damn right.
And in San Antonio, a young activist brought millions of Mexican Americans who had never voted to the polls, eventually doubling the number of Latinos elected to political office.
Because of his will, his sheer will, we became a part of the American system.
During the 1960s and 70s, a whole generation of Mexican Americans discovered a new sense of pride as they fought for equality and challenged America to accept them on their own terms. California's Central Valley. 23,000 acres of some of the most productive farmland on the planet. In the 1960s, while the agricultural companies that owned the land became wealthy, tens of thousands of farm laborers who worked the land remained desperately poor.
These were inhumane conditions. They were un-American conditions. They were conditions that relegated these farm workers to the lowest workers in the whole country.
Most were Mexican Americans who could neither read nor write. Most would die by the age of 49. And to most of the country, they were invisible.
Every time we sit at that table to have something to eat, the fruit and the vegetables got there because someone was exploited. They're subjected to the sun and to the heat, to the cold, and to pesticide poisoning. They're treated like animals. And they endure all the sacrifices and all the suffering so you can eat and I can eat. These men and women and children feed all of us, and they don't have any food for themselves, and we're going to change it. It's going to be changed.
Cesar Chavez was the second of 6 children, born into a devout Catholic family on a modest ranch in Yuma, Arizona. They lost the ranch during the Great Depression and were soon forced to enter the backbreaking world of migrant labor. Traveling across California, taking whatever work they could find, the Chavez children passed through 37 schools in 3 years. Cesar dropped out at the age of 14 to work full-time in the fields.
What was amazing about Caesar is that he was almost entirely and completely self-possessed. He never got past the 8th grade, and yet he was brilliant.
After a stint in the Navy, Chavez worked for the CSO, the Community Service Organization, a group dedicated to improving the lives of Mexican Americans. There, he met someone who shared his passion for justice, a 28-year-old former school teacher from Stockton, California, Dolores Huerta.
In the school where I was teaching, there were a lot of malnutrition of children. So I went to my principal and I said, you know, these kids, you're obviously very hungry. You know, can I get a voucher for shoes, for lunch for these kids? And his response was, their parents, all they do is drink up all their money. I knew he was wrong.
A frustrated Huerta had quit her teaching job to join the CSO. At a meeting in San Francisco in 1962, Cesar Chavez approached her with an idea that would alter the course of their lives.
He said, you and I have to organize a union. And then he said, but we will not see a national union in our lifetime. And I said, why? He said, because the Gores are too rich, they're too powerful, and they're too racist.
For Huerta, a divorced mother with 7 children, committing herself to the farm worker cause was an agonizing decision.
And that was a big step for me to have family that I had to support. And I remember just thinking about this. This is such a foolish thing to do, but I just remembered I've got to do this, and I did it.
But a serious obstacle stood in the way of creating a farm workers' union. The Bracero program, a government initiative left over from World War II that brought in Mexican laborers to replace Americans who were fighting overseas.
This is the vanguard of 1,500 Mexicans brought to the States by the Farm Security Administration. Most are laborers. All of them are bachelors.
When the war ended, the program continued to bring in a nearly unlimited supply of cheap laborers from Mexico, desperate for work. But once in the U.S., their employers could use them as strikebreakers and have them deported if they complained.
They weren't allowed to organize into unions. The workers were literally like slaves.
The Bracero program was finally ended in 1964, after 20 years of opposition by Mexican-American leaders.
I was able to go to Washington, D.C., and Cesar and I worked together, working with the Secretary of Labor, and we were able to end that program.
Now, a viable union seemed possible. But the history of unionism in the United States was scarred by violence. Since the 1930s, dozens of strikes had bloodied the streets and fields of California. Attacks and retaliation often triggered cycles of violence that robbed workers of public support and doomed the strikes to failure.
We knew that in the past history of organizing farm workers that there had been a lot of violence. We knew farm workers had been killed.
Chavez and Huerta admired Mahatma Gandhi, who had gained India's independence from England through a non-violent campaign.
For both of them, nonviolence was not just a strategy. It was a principle of how to live your life. That if you believed in the principle of human dignity, you didn't harm another human being.
For 3 years, Chavez and Huerta signed up farm workers, gradually building their union. But in September 1965, they were caught off guard. Filipino grape workers near Delano, California, went on strike, demanding higher wages.
We voted to support the Filipino workers, but we were very naive. We made these big old signs that said huelga, which means strike in Spanish. First day, we had a couple of strikers that were beaten up, and it was not a good experience.
Here's this young woman, not that big, leading a struggle. And she was challenging the role of women among farm workers. They had never seen an aggressive, independent woman like Dolores.
Come on out, brothers. We are waiting for you. You are earning more money today because the workers say we're not on strike on September the 9th.
And I found myself in a position where I was willing to be a lieutenant, to be a follower.
The strike unfolding in the San Joaquin Valley resonated with Valdez, an aspiring young playwright who'd grown up in Delano.
We were migrant farm workers, and so I was in the fields before I could walk. I was in my mother's arms, and like a lot of migrant kids, I used to sleep in a fruit box while she worked. And eventually, when I was old enough to walk, I began to work.
Engaging in conversation.
Valdez soon became part of Cesar Chavez's inner circle.
Caesar was relatively young, but he was mesmerizing. I mean, his presence. And I'm not talking about something flashy. I'm talking about something very basic, very humble. But his sense of place and time, of what to do under the given circumstances, came from a confidence that he had within him. That confidence inspired all of us.
After 4 months, the strike was going nowhere. Growers bussed in non-union workers to pick the grapes and break the strike. As the harvest wound down, the union was almost broke, and Chavez was losing hope.
In the crop season, there is a period where everything is germinating. The vines have been pruned, they've been deleafed, it's been irrigated. Now you got to wait for the new crop to kick in. And so there's the dead season, what the farm workers call invierno chiquito, the little winter. That was a dangerous time for the union because there are no workers in the field.
Chavez was beginning to believe the strike could never be won in the fields. He desperately wanted to bring the movement into the national spotlight.
Caesar came up with this brilliant idea of marching to Sacramento.
In the manner of Martin Luther King, who garnered media attention leading a march through Alabama in 1965, Chavez would lead a 300-mile pilgrimage from Delano to the state capitol, passing through farm workers' towns along the way.
Caesar said it's going to be a march of penitence. And the workers said, well, we don't have anything to be penitent about. I mean, the growers are the ones that are doing everything wrong. And he said, no, I want everybody to think of something that you've done, some gossip maybe, some fight that you had. Think of your own things in your own life.
It was a pilgrimage. This was a spiritual pilgrimage. It was an attempt to suggest to the workers and others this was going to be a long struggle.
As he planned for the march, Chavez's faith was being tested. Striking workers were subjected to physical and verbal attacks from growers, who seemed to have law enforcement in their pocket. On March 16, 1966, with the situation threatening to explode, the Senate Subcommittee on Migratory Labor held hearings in Delano.
The fact that somebody makes a report about somebody's going to...
As news cameras rolled, Senator Robert Kennedy grilled the local sheriff on his practice of arresting peaceful demonstrators.
Who told you that they're going to riot?
The men right out in the field that they were talking to said, if you don't get them out of here, we're going to cut their hearts out. So rather than let them get cut, you remove the cause.
This is the most interesting concept, I think. How can you go arrest somebody if they haven't violated the law?
They're ready to violate the law. In other words...
Could I suggest in the luncheon period of time that the sheriff and the district attorney read the Constitution of the United States?
The farm workers have suffered in our society over the period of the last 30 years, and that situation has to be changed.
Chavez set out the very next morning, along with 100 farm workers, to begin his pilgrimage through California's San Joaquin Valley.
Caesar, either by